Welcome to the Rewild Gear Podcast. Modern life, society, and responsibilities have domesticated us. But now it's time to rediscover your adventurous side. Whether that's camping, hiking, hunting, fishing, or just spending time in the great outdoors, this is the podcast for you. Join us as we get back to the wilderness and rewild. Welcome to the Adventure Made podcast presented by Rewild Gear. I'm your host, Seth Spears, and today I am here with my good friend, Joel Runyon. He is an endurance athlete and entrepreneur and the founder of Impossible, a performance lifestyle brand dedicated to helping people push the limits and do something impossible. In 2017, Joel became the youngest person to run an ultra marathon on every continent while raising over $200,000 for education nonprofit initiatives around the world. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, dude. Excited to be here.
Yeah, good times. Joel, why don't we just get started by just kind of telling your background story and how you got into endurance athletics and ultramarathons and all that stuff, and to where you are today in business and entrepreneurship and all the fun things that you're doing.
Yeah. So I got started, let's see, this is a long time ago now. So it's like basically I graduated college, and I kind of had lived up to that point, kind of lived my life like you're supposed to get good grades. I was doing multiple sports, got a great GPA, learned another language. It was just kind of following the script life laid out for me. And then like the next thing was like graduate and get a job. And I feel like since I was a kid, everybody always knew what they wanted to be, and I never really had something like that. I had my own little lawn mowing business at one point because I was like, I'm not working at McDonald's. I'll just make a bunch of money on the weekends and I can do it really quickly. And so when it came time to graduate and go to school, it was also in or get a job after school. It was 2009. It was right in the middle of the recession. And so it was a terrible time to graduate, and I had done all the things you were supposed to do, and then like kind of got spat out in life, and then was just kind of floating for a minute. And it was a little bit depressing. I was like back at home in my parents' basement.
Yep.
And it was also just like, I'd done all these things that you're supposed to do, and life isn't turning out like it's supposed to. And so, I was kind of thrown into entrepreneurship. There's a long story of me applying to Target and Starbucks, and I couldn't even get jobs at those places at this point because the economy was so bad. I did like a short stint at UPS, and I was just like sitting at home in my parents' basement after getting laid off after like a seasonal Christmas push. And just being like, is this really everything that it's cracked up to be? And so I started getting into websites, started playing around with websites on my own, learning stuff about that. Ended up poking around. I was like, I don't know anything about internet marketing, but I like the internet. I'm spending all my time on it, and I like kind of like marketing. So maybe I'll put them together. And ended up taking like this super entry level position at a marketing firm for like a little bit, and then basically used that and started a blog at the same time, and used that to like find some traction in the world. And the short version of that is I worked my way up from like entry level sales guy to like marketing director at that firm, got recruited to another firm, did that for a little bit, and then after like a couple of years of just doing agency work, I realized like I could be doing this for myself. So I kind of had a bunch of projects, Impossible and a few other nutrition health related things I was spinning up at the same time. And it's just like, I'm just going to go all in on that. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of the short version of it.
Sure. Gotcha. So let's dig into Impossible a little bit, where that concept came from. And I know that's tied into some of the endurance racing that you've done. So let's hear a little bit of that story.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of runs in tandem with all this stuff. So I had graduated, I got this UPS thing for the seasonal work, and got laid off, and I was just like sitting around my house and be like, I did all this work, and this is what I have to show for it. Like I did all the things I was supposed to do, and this is what I'm like watching Netflix in my parents' basement, and that's it. And Starbucks won't call me back. So it wasn't like a good place mentally. I was pretty bummed out. And I had things I wanted to do. I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to start a business. I wanted to do all these things, but I didn't have any money. I didn't really have the confidence to start a business. and like I couldn't even get a job at Starbucks. And so everything really felt impossible to me at the time.
Mhm.
But I sat down and I started writing out things I wanted to do. And even if they seemed crazy, I just wrote them down. And I would come back to this list and just feel bad about myself on a regular basis. But,
Mhm.
you can't do that. Still can't do that. Can't do that. But then there was one thing on the list that I could do, or that I came to, and I didn't have a reason why I couldn't do it. And that was run a triathlon. And I'm
Hmm.
like, you got the time, you got the equipment, like you could run around your parents' house on your shoes and you can get your middle school bike and bust that out and like ride around the block. Like you could train for this if you want to. But I'd never done any distance stuff. I was an athlete, but I'd never done any, like I've never run more than a 5K.
Yeah.
And so the idea of doing that was crazy to me. And so I eventually just bit the bullet, signed up for a race, and I trained for like 6 weeks, and I went ahead and did it.
Wow.
It was an indoor triathlon at Lifetime Fitness, which is like the easiest level of triathlon you could ever, possibly do. But like when I finished that race, I had this moment where I was thinking to myself, it was, you spent so much time telling yourself that this was impossible and you just did it.
Mhm.
If that's true, what other things out there that you think are impossible could you do if you just went out and trained for it?
Mhm.
And so that led me down this endurance path of training for one race, then training for multiple races, training for longer races. I'd mentioned I never ran more than a 5K, but through these triathlons, it basically tricked myself into running like half marathons. And then I was like, oh, I guess I'm a runner now. And then I got into like half marathons, then started getting into the ultra marathon space. And so that's kind of how it's built up. And they're really interesting. Races specifically are really well designed to, every time you push yourself to the edge of what you think you can do, there's always another
Mhm.
distance. So there's another type of race, or there's, it can be farther, it can be more challenging terrain wise. There's a bunch of different ways you can go about it, but it's always interesting. You get done with one race and you're like, I'm never going to do that again. And then like once the pain wears off, you're like, maybe.
Got it. Now, pushing yourself like that, I'm guessing you went from the list that you had made of all the things you wanted to do, and like, you can't do this, I can't do that, to the triathlon, and then like, oh, I can do that, and you did it, and you push yourself. Tell me about the mindset shift that happened there.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because there's a quote that goes like, how you do anything is how you do everything. And
Yes, I love that quote.
and I was like stuck in my parents' basement feeling bad about myself from work, but it was also just like bleeding over in my life. I was just sitting on the couch every day, like not doing anything.
Mhm.
And so once I found some way to get some real world traction on like doing something with my body in the physical world, I started to realize that like, okay, the narrative I've got in my head of like, you can't do this triathlon is actually not true. It's literally not true because you just did it. And so there's something off about what the story of what you're telling yourself is versus what like reality is actually like. So, so then it kind of becomes like a challenge or an adventure of finding out what, you know, what reality is actually like. And if you're going to push yourself, like how far you can start pushing yourself. And so what really unlocked it for me was, I call them reference points in races. There's a lot of, for the first race I ever did, it was like at the finish line, I finished it. And I was like, oh, like I'm like, I still don't think about myself as a triathlete at that point, as a runner or whatever, but I just did a triathlon. So I guess I am a triathlete. Like that's like,
You did it.
yeah, it's factually true. So even if my brain wants to think that I'm not, it is. So you kind of update your operating system there, and then you say like, okay, given this new operating system, where do I go from here? And so one of the things that I love about physical challenges and adventures is that like it gives you unfalsifiable proof. Like if you just do like mental challenges or internet stuff, like sometimes it's easy to like trick yourself into still living in your head. But when you have to get out of your head and into your body, you start realizing of like what are real world accomplishments that like can't be denied, that are like, if you write them down, you make them part of your list and you write them up or you talk about them,
Mhm.
you can always point back to another situation. And you're like, if you're in the middle of a place right now where you're like, I don't know if I can keep going, I don't know if I can keep pushing, I can look back and be like, well, I thought that like mile 40 of the race in Antarctica, and I somehow finished that thing. So it's like, just because your head is telling you one story doesn't mean it's actually true. And it's really good to continually remind yourself that like you can do way more than you think you can. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered the question, but that's kind of like how physical challenges in general, they just continually update like, your worldview and like where you're at and what you're capable of, because most people
Sure.
don't actually physically push themselves out to the point where you have to do that manual override and just keep going.
So I'm really interested in this, like the mind body connection and which tends to drive which. And so I just got back from Montana, doing a week long backpacking trip, 10,500 foot elevation, over 55 pounds on my back, for 5 days hiking 35 miles over the course of a week. And, that's very physically exhausting. It's probably one of the most physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausting things that I've ever done. And during part of that, the hike, when we're hiking 5 miles up really steep terrain and then down steep terrain, and I'm physically exhausted, but also mentally as well. And I kept going back and forth in my own head, which is leading which? Is my brain leading my body, or is my body leading my brain? And at times it felt like it was one, then it was the other. So it was like my head was telling my body, push through, you can do it. You're strong, you can do it. And then it was like sometimes my body had to tell my brain, get out of your own head and just go and quit thinking about it and just act. So I'm curious, as far as your experience, is it mind over matter? Is it matter over mind? Which is it?
Yeah. So I find there's like a default, like there's like always a background voice of like, hey, you should quit, you should give up, whatever. So it's like, that's kind of like the default. And I usually call it like doing a manual override. So like you get into you're up in the mountains and you get super tired and your brain starts hurting, and there's like these ruts that it's easy for your mind or your thoughts to get into, and then like they kind of play on each other, like you said. It's like, oh, I'm hurting, so now I'm tired, and my legs hurt, so maybe I should slow down. And then like it's easy to let yourself kind of spiral downwards like that.
Mhm.
What I always find is just like there's a piece at the beginning of the races that nobody ever talks about, and people always want to know like, how do you keep going when it goes hard? And usually the answer that I give people is like, it's not an option to quit. Like quitting isn't an option. When I've done all of my races, it's usually like if I show up to the starting line, I'm finishing it. It's like unless I break a leg or like I'm like actually really hurt, like I'm not giving myself the chance to back out. And I think a lot of people don't do that. And so when they find themselves in the middle of a hard situation, they're looking for the exit points. And in their mind, they've like preset, like if it gets too tough, then like maybe I'll leave, or maybe like they haven't actually committed to the end goal.
Mm.
And so when they're, those ruts start coming, they're like, oh, I am tired, I am worn out, I am exhausted. They start like looking for the exit ramps. And so what I find is like that those are going to happen either way. Like
Sure.
you're going to be looking for those exit ramps at some point if you're doing anything sufficiently hard. The two things that I do to combat that is, one, commitment up front to be like, it's not an option. And when that comes up, you're going to expect that. But then when it does, you do a manual override. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And there's ways people do that. A lot of times I just, I just grumble and I mutter to myself. Some people like have specific affirmations or cadences that they go through.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I started doing for some workouts was like, it was just like just being like overly positive to the point where it's like, you're like, I'm lying to myself, but in the process of lying to myself, I'm actually making myself in a better mood.
Yeah.
Or I'm like, oh, this is super easy, or this feels great, or like, great day to be out here. I'm lying to myself, but like I'm basically faking myself into like, yeah, like, okay, it is. Yeah, doing the reverse of, instead of being like, oh, this is so hard,
Yeah.
and then your body starts to feel it more, you do the reverse. You're like, oh, this is easy, and you're like, is it? Maybe
it
and then you
is.
start feeling better. So I find there's always like these background processes, and then it's just up to you to mentally override those,
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to pop up no matter who you are, because it's not fun to be uncomfortable. Like
Yeah.
if it was, like it wouldn't be called uncomfortable. Like,
Sure. Yeah. And I think what you're talking about as well, as far as being that dedicated and not giving yourself an out and just saying, I'm doing this, I'm completing it. That's great advice, no matter what, whether that's a sport, whether that's a relationship, whether that's a business, in so many areas of life, where you're just saying, I'm doing it, that's it, period. And just being dedicated and following it through to the end. And I think as a society, we've gotten really soft and we don't look at it that way anymore. It's like, oh, I'm going to dabble in this, or I'm going to stick my toes in and see how it goes. But there's not really any dedication or pushing through, because it's only when you push through those things that are super hard that you find out what you're made of, what you're worth, and that you can do a lot more than you thought you could.
and there's the real aspect of a lot of people try to couch things, and we like to do spectrums these days. Like, that's really popular. A lot of it's like, it's people are trying to soften failure, right? Like, they're basically, they're worried they're going to fail, and so they don't want to have the failure. So they're going to be like, okay, there's a wide range of successful outcomes here. And maybe that's true. Like, you could win a race or you could finish a race. It depends on what your goal is.
Mm-hmm.
But like, whatever the goal is, like, stick to the goal. And if you fail, sometimes the best things you can do are failing, because you had a specific goal and you didn't get to it. And now you have to self-reflect on like what you need to do better next time. But when people pull that, it's under the guise of like, being more helpful to everybody, and like, you don't want anybody to feel bad. But like, to me, these aren't like other people making me feel bad. This is like a commitment I made to myself.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I find is really underrated is making promises to yourself and then keeping them, and then building trust with yourself on a regular basis. Because if you go out and you do one thing hard, this is like knowing where your limits are and what's reasonable to push. But like, if you go out and you're going to do something hard, but you like trust yourself to get through it, even if you're not quite sure how, and you figure it out and you get through it, even though it was really freaking hard, the next time you have something very difficult to go do and you're still not sure you can do it, you're like, hey, I don't know how I'm going to get this done. Mm-hmm. But I have trust in myself to navigate difficult situations, and I'm going to be able to push through anyways. And so it's that, a lot of people get worried about what other people are going to think, all this other stuff. And to me, it's much more about like, can you trust yourself to come through for yourself when you're going to take on something that's like, there's a delta between what you've done before and where you're going.
Yes.
And do you trust yourself to get yourself through that gap? And most people break promises to themselves all the time, and then they try to do bigger things than they're capable of, and then they fail, and then they lose a lot more trust, going forward, and then they kind of get stuck in this rut. And I think this idea of incrementally challenging yourself, so you're not just pushing yourself, but you're building that layer of trust with yourself, is hugely underrated, and really necessary if you're going to be doing stuff that's like continually outside, what you've done in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know in my own life, I will honor a commitment that I made to someone else 100%. However, a commitment that I make to myself, that's a hell of a lot easier to break for whatever reason. And, and that's a self-realization that I've had over the past several months, and something that I'm really working on, because if you can't honor your commitments to yourself, you can't trust yourself, then how can anyone else trust you?
Yeah. And it's like, if you can't make the commitments to yourself, like, your commitments to other people actually matter. Like, maybe they do, but maybe you're just doing that because you don't want to let them down, not because you're actually committed to, doing the thing for them. So I think always coming back to yourself and be like, listen, this is something I'm coming through for me. And like, if you miss the mark, then you need to reevaluate on it. But yeah, I know a lot of people that are people pleasers, and they want to do everything for everybody else. And then it comes to themselves, and they never come through for themselves. And then they have like a crippling aspect on their self-esteem or what they think they can do, because they always let themselves down, but they never let anyone else down. And it just kind of ruins what they're able to do, in their own life.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Mentally, have you always had this kind of outlook on it? Or is this something that you've learned as you've done the endurance racing and just pushed yourself and, built up as part of your own brand?
Yeah. I mean, well, at first it was literally like, I was kind of the opposite. Like, I did an indoor triathlon. Like, it's not like, I swam in a pool because I was scared to drown. Like I was like, if I'm in open water, I don't know, trust myself. So I'm just going to do laps in a pool. And it was like, you're on a stationary bike and a treadmill. So it's like, I pretty much started at the opposite of whatever, like the smallest starting point for you. I guess I could have done a walkathon or something like that, but like pretty close to the start of where you could start with races. And for me, it was just a natural growth. And I think I've always been a little bit like hard headed and just like, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. Get out of my way. But like, it was something where I didn't try to run an ultra marathon after never running before. I wasn't wild about it. I did an indoor triathlon, then I did a sprint, then I did an Olympic, then I did a couple others, then I did a half Ironman, and then I got into half marathons, and this other stuff. But it was a progression. And what I think sometimes people do, they get excited, and their excitement leads them to do these big leaps. And sometimes they're not ready for those leaps. And so they try to take one. And like I said, they haven't figured out how to trust themselves on what they're going to do. So they'll try something really big, fail, and then they end up like worse than when they started. And so what I did, it was kind of like a natural progression. Like I said, I think I've always been a little bit hard-headed. Like I had an entrepreneurial streak from when I was a kid. But from the mental fortitude standpoint, I think endurance sports and physical, like actual physical, there's a lot of talk about like, like inner work and like all this other stuff. But like, I find hard physical challenges transform your mind and your body better than anything else, because you can't deny if you've been hiking for 3 days and every piece of you is on fire and you're over it and you could just sit down and sit in the mountains and lay down and die if you want to. Like you can, like, you're out in the elements
because you're 20 miles in and there's nobody that's gonna like pull you out.
So this is why I love like trail races, is like you end up like that. You're doing like a 50-mile race and you're 20 miles in on the top of a mountain and you're done and you're tired and you're like, what am I doing? How am I going to get home? And you could just sit down and die if you want to. Like that's an option. Or you could like, listen, it's going to be just as bad going back as it is going forward. So like, let's, stop feeling bad for yourself, get it all together and keep going. And when you have to do that, that changes your perspective when you come back to like, oh, I'm having a business problem. And you're like, that's, it's serious. Like you care about your business, but like, it doesn't hurt physically in the same way that like, every single muscle is on fire or like, in the middle of a race, I know I've like my back, like, will like fall apart, but it's a different perspective. And then you're able to take that same mentality and apply it in, a business is still as challenging, but it's just more mentally taxing. And when you're able to take these challenges outside of your head and like experience them through your body, it's so much better in my opinion. And it gives you real life reference points to kind of work off going forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Joel, I want to talk about goals and goal setting. There's different philosophies when it comes to goal setting. Some people say that you should set them as high as possible. So, it's like the old saying, if you aim for the stars, even if you fail, you hit the moon. So it's, you've gotten further than you would have. And then others say, set small but attainable goals, because that's building up that self-confidence within you so that you can eventually hit bigger and bigger ones. I'm curious to get your take on that and how you see goal setting there.
Yeah. So I basically work off my like impossible list framework, which is it's a lot of people compare it to a bucket list, but like it's, in my opinion, it's very different.
Okay.
A lot of people put on a bucket list. They just write a bunch of things they want to do, which is cool. And like, it's kind of like that aim for the stars type mentality where you're like, I'm going to try to just do a whole bunch of things. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is like most people don't end up doing much on it at all because there's not something super actionable. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? Get to the stars. Like how?
What are the steps?
Yeah, like where do you go? And so a lot of people get excited. They make a bucket list one time, never do anything on it. And it's like super exciting, but it just never happens. And so the way I talk about the impossible list is like, what feels impossible right now? Like you should be pushing yourself right now, but maybe that's not, maybe it doesn't feel like a small step. Like when I did a triathlon, I didn't think it was like a small step. I thought it was like, I might do this, but like I said, it was an indoor triathlon. I purposely did it because I was like scared of open water swim and drowning and all this stuff. So it was like, it seemed like a lot to me at the time. And so, like, looking back now, it looks like a small step, but it was, I was in such a bad spot that it was the edge of what I was comfortable with. And so,
Yeah.
I like to challenge people like, what's the most difficult thing that you could do like relatively soon?
Mm.
Because it's not easy. Like, it's not necessarily going to be easy for someone, because that's not challenging or that's not actually interesting. But you also don't want to be so difficult that like there's 17 steps and you have to learn a new language to figure it out. Like it just gets way too big. And so um, I didn't have ideas. I didn't even know what an ultra marathon was until I ran my first marathon.
Wow.
Like I wasn't thinking that far ahead. It was something that like you kind of push the edges of your limits and then they expand. Then you kind of find a little bit more of what's out there. It's like old video games where it's like like you start off on a map
Mhm.
and everything is blacked out and you don't know what else is on the map
Yeah.
until like you send a guy out and then he kind of, he finds a little bit more space around it. And so you don't always really know what you're capable of until you send a couple little guys out, you do a couple of events and some stuff. It's like, maybe you do it one time and you're like, I hated that. There was nothing fun about it. I don't want to do it anymore. And it's like, okay, like, don't bother with that. Like, you don't have to keep doing stuff that sucks just because you think it's going to make you better. Like, you should find a mix of things that are worth doing, even though they're hard,
Mhm.
and that you get something out of, even though they're difficult. Because it's not always the things that people just really, really want to do. Like, it's not always like like ice cream's great, but like you're just going to eat ice cream all the time. Like, your life's not really going to get. Maybe it would. Maybe it'd be really great, but I don't think it would necessarily make your life better. It's the things that are difficult, but still rewarding. Those are the things that are, in my opinion, like worth doing and are meaningful.
Yeah, for sure. Why do you think as a society, and for men especially, we've gotten so soft? We're just all about the comfort and the convenience of modern life. And so many people are just not willing to push themselves and get out of their comfort zone and really see what they can do.
Well, I don't think people have to anymore, right? Like it's not. It's not a daily requirement of life. Like, it's not like you have to like get up every day and be like, am I going to eat today? Am I going to find, like am I going to have some, like warring tribe come in and like, try to kill me and all my family? Like,
Sure.
we don't have to deal with that. And so, it's like anything. If you practice it a bunch, it's, you get better at it. And, I think I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. I think a lot of people, like, we have like arguably the best time in history to be alive. Like, you go back 100 years and like the richest person in the world didn't have AC. So you're like, okay, even if you're doing really bad, like,
Yeah.
you got stuff that like other people never had. But like, we have huge numbers of like, from obesity, from like over like just overall health issues, like mental illness, like all these things that are popping up that says like, okay, we have a lot of conveniences, but maybe like I find I do really well when I have something to struggle against. Like, having some sort of ongoing challenge not only literally makes you stronger, but like feels good. Effort feels good. And so when you don't have anything worthwhile that you're going after, you don't have anything meaningful that you're struggling for, like, you just start looking like it kind of becomes like a pit of despair, and you're like, what am I even doing out here?
Yeah.
One of the things that was really impactful for me was a book called "A Million Miles in 1,000 Years" by Donald Miller.
Mm.
And basically, he had a memoir, and he was in the process of turning his memoir into this best-selling book into a movie. And in it, he basically had to go through and edit the book to make it more of a movie, so it could be a better story, and a narrative story.
Sure.
And in the process, he basically talks about like he started to realize that like all the things that make like a good story are also the things that make a good life. And the point of writing a good story, like a story is a character who wants something and is willing to overcome an obstacle for it.
So following like the
And
hero's journey arc.
yeah. And for me, when I was sitting in my parents' basement, like I didn't really have anything I wanted. And if I did, I wasn't really willing to overcome anything for it. I was just like, I just want it. But when I started looking at my life like a story and be like, is this an interesting story? Would you want to, be a part of this? I was just kind of like, no, I wouldn't. And so then I started picking out things that would be, maybe they're, they're kind of like starting points for what would make my life a good story. And that's kind of how I kicked things off. And then I kind of, started just picking out races and different challenges that I wanted to do. But it all came back to, are you living a good story? Is there anything about this that, like, if somebody was watching your story, your life story, is it, would they walk out in the middle of the movie? Like, and for me, like that's kind of where I was.
That's a great analogy. I love the quote from Aristotle. Man is a goal-seeking animal. His life only has meaning when he is pursuing a worthy or worthwhile goal or objective. And I think that really speaks to what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, I find if I'm bored, it's usually my fault. It's usually like I don't have anything specific that I'm building towards or I'm going after. And having those things is what, it's not the only thing, but like I think my life is better when I'm pushing forward and I'm like making sacrifices for things that are at least I think are going to be worthwhile.
Sure. Joel, what's the biggest life lesson that you've learned over the years by really pushing yourself to these limits or beyond the limits, really?
Yeah, like I don't think most people know what they're physically capable of. Like, I mean, you could take that to like life, but I think starting with physicality is huge because again, if you can overcome something like physical discomfort, it's a lot easier. You're basically practicing to do all the like getting through mental discomfort, like all the things that like plague like modern society on a regular basis. Like I think that one of the reasons people run into so many issues because we're on our computer, we're on our headphones, and we're just like locked in and we're trying to maintain it all right here in our head. And when you can experience that in your body, it makes like everything easier. And so for me, it's just like, I never even thought like, I grew up playing sports, but I wasn't like the craziest athlete or anything like that. I did track and field in college and I threw javelin because I didn't want to run. Like I was like, I don't want to run at all. So
the irony here is amazing.
Yeah. And so the idea of like, if you would have told me like, oh, you should run ultra marathons, I probably would have like actively not done it just to like prove you wrong.
Yeah.
And so the idea of like just continually pushing at the edges of whatever you're capable of right now, like you can end up in places where you're like, I had no clue, absolutely no clue that I would have been capable of doing that. But I just started on like the thing that is most immediate and is pressing and like is also difficult. And you can really surprise yourself on, what you end up being capable of.
Yeah. I'd love to dig into some of the stories that you have of either your ultra marathon events, running a marathon on every continent. That's an incredible feat, just an amazing accomplishment. So I'm guessing it all just wasn't wine and roses, and you've got some pretty incredible stories surrounding some of those. So let's hear, one or two of your most memorable ones.
Well, it took me way longer than I thought it would. It's funny. You think about like, okay, I'm going to run an ultra marathon on each continent. It's probably going to be like hard to, like the running is like the hardest part, right? And for me, it was kind of laughable because I did this announcement. I went out and did my first race, and I got hurt like basically the first marathon in. After like 26 miles, I like rolled my ankle pretty severely, and then like it had 14 miles left, and so I was like, I'm not, I'm down in Patagonia, Chile. I'm not going home without doing this race, and so I hobbled my way to the finish line. It was ugly and not really great, but I finished. And I thought I was like, I'm going to ice my leg and I'll be fine. Spoiler alert, was not fine. Had to do like 6 months of rehab to fix, fix my leg. Right after that, I had a lawsuit with my business, and so that delayed everything even further. And so then, so like a year and a half after I'd finished, race number one, I'm like, I'm gonna do 7 ultras on 7 continents. I'd done like one race on one continent, hadn't run in a long time, and raised like $20,000, but like we're trying to raise like $200,000. I'm like, you're not even close. And so that was one of those ones where I was like, I came to myself like you said you're going to do this, you haven't done it. You can either finish this and do the thing you said you're going to do. You can give up and you can like own up to it, or like, but you're not just going to like continue like coasting and pretend like this didn't happen. Like this needs a resolution. Yeah. So I ended up doing a race in Chicago, like a 50K, just on my own without announcing it or anything, just because I was like, I need to prove to myself that, again, I need to build that trust up. I need to prove to myself that I can do this. And if I can't do it, then I'm just like, I'll probably give up and I'll just be like, I'm sorry, guys, I can't do it. I'm just a terrible runner. But I did it. And then I was like, okay, I built up that level of trust. What are the races coming up? I had to pick a whole new set of races that I was going to do, but what are the races coming up where I can knock this out? And then basically did the last 5 races in like 3.5 months or 4 months.
Wow.
And so, that was the first thing. It was like, I thought the running was going to be the hard part, but it was like logistics. It was like, oh, I'm going to do this impossible challenge. And it's like, okay, well, you're going to have an injury. You're going to have money issues. You're going to have business stuff, like all this other stuff that came up that you have no idea about is like thrown in your face.
Yeah.
So that was one. There's like different ones. Antarctica was this epic, 100K ultra marathon that, like 40, like I said, 40 miles in, at my it was like the third race in like 4 weeks or something like that I was doing. And like,
oh my gosh,
my back was hurting and I was just like, I'm ready for it. But I'm also like 40 miles in. I'm like, I don't get a second chance to come down here and do this. Like, I'm not going home. Like,
yeah,
I could pout, I can do whatever, but like, you're finishing the race. Like, it doesn't, like you talk to yourself and just like, you could whine, you could be a brat, you can do whatever you want, but like, it's not going to change the situation. You're finishing the race. So you might as well like get a better attitude out here. What else did I do? I did an overnight race in Narrabeen, Australia. It was like the last. It was New Year's Eve to New Year's Day, so it was like the last, the last race of the new year and the first race of race of the old year and the first race of the new year.
Got it.
So ran through the night, drank champagne at midnight, and kept going. That was fun. I had a race in Finland where I ran out of water.
Oh,
it was in the Arctic Circle. I was unsupported. I ran out of water. At one point, I got to a campfire, and they had like a cast iron pan. So I filled it up with snow from the surrounding area and melted it down, and then like poured it in my water bottle. But it was so cold outside that like a mile and a half later, it was all frozen again in my water bottle.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just like, I got lost twice. Like I finished the race and my foot was swollen. Like it was a whole bunch of stuff that went wrong. But like the last mile on in, you're coming down this like frozen river and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And you're like, is that the city lights? What's going on? And it's like, I've been out there for like 12 hours or something stupid. Everything's gone wrong, but I'm just like going to, I'm trying to finish the race. I'm just like, I'm just going to be just going to do it. And like the last mile and a half or a couple miles, like the northern lights just pop up and it's like the show. So it's like, it's one of those ones where you're like, I'm suffering this whole time. Like, it's just like, it's almost a comedy of errors of like how many things went wrong. But like you push through, and then you get to the end and it's like, okay, like definitely story worthy. Nice. Like there's definitely something about that. So, there's always, stories. And I think the thing that's intriguing about ultra marathons for me is it's not just about racing. It's, there's a lot of like marathons you can run around a city and, a bunch of crowds. with ultras, especially like trail and adventure ones, you're kind of out there on your own.
Mm.
So nobody really cares if if you quit, that's cool. Like you and the race director know, but nobody else really cares. Uh, but I love the adventures, the stories, and like just being out in nature and like seeing parts of the world that you might see on a 5-day hike, but like unless you're running it or you're spending a week out there, you're not gonna like accidentally get to some of these spots. Like you
Sure.
have to you have to try to get to them, and that's what I love is like you end up seeing these things that uh, your own 2 feet took you to, and you got there, and there's no faking it. There's no like you get to have those memories, and you kind of get to explore the world in a pretty cool way that most people don't get to.
Yeah, totally. Tell me about that love of nature. What instilled that, and where did that come from?
That's a good question. I grew up outside Chicago, so like my grandma had a farm, and we'd go out to there. We'd go up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan every once in a while, and you'd see like a million
Oh yeah.
stars. And I was like, these are cool. Um, but I don't know, man. Like there's something grounding about getting out there. It's also like you feel small and like in a good way, where
Mm-hmm.
uh, nothing. It seems like you're kind of insignificant, but also like if you're insignificant, why not just do cool stuff? Because
Why not?
if nothing matters, nothing like go for it. And then yeah, I just love. I don't know, like you talked about being the world being soft, and like okay, yeah, in my air conditioned apartment, like things seem really nice, but it's something different when climbing a mountain is so strange. You just like, hey, there's that tall thing. I'm gonna go up to the top, and then I'm coming back down. Uh, but like when you get up there and you realize like you did that, and like you can kind of see what you accomplished. There's something just like I think it's like just intrinsic about that is really really satisfying. And some of these races you go up, and there's one race in Switzerland, and you climb up these two massive mountains. It's in
Mm.
they measure it in kilometers, so I don't even know how high I am. All I know is that there's like 1,000 foot
Wow.
drop off on either side and all these different things. And I'm in the middle of a race, and you get up to these top peaks, and your hands are frozen, like you can't really feel like like it's raining, like it was a whole bunch of bad stuff happening, but you just get to the top and you're like, okay, I know I'm in the race, but I'm just going to take a minute and just like I'm gonna enjoy the view, because
Yeah.
it was a lot of work to get up here. So I think it's I think it's just a combination of just that primal instinct of like, this feels good, this feels natural, this feels like uncomfortable, but in a good way. And then also just like the self-sufficiency that like once you get out there, nobody's coming for you. Like get yourself
Yeah.
home. Like I guess they had helicopters at the Switzerland one that like they'd come pick you up, but like
Just in case.
yeah, but like I'm not, like I guess I'm prideful enough. I'm just like I'm gonna get myself home. So I just love that. I love putting that onus on you, and then like showing up for yourself and being able to do that.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree for sure. There's a lot of people that don't see it that way, though. So many people who they have this us versus nature mentality. Like nature, we have to conquer it and tame it and make it, less wild, if you will. And then others like myself, and I think like you as well, that the thing we loved about nature and the wilderness is that wild, because we can rediscover kind of who we are, our more primitive and base nature, and we can push ourselves. Why do you think that some people, they kind of have that different viewpoint on it?
I think this binary thing of like, again, the interesting thing about like, if you're doing this 5-day hike, like there's no like spectrum. Like I guess you could have like a really good time out there. You could have a really bad time, but like also if you like do a bunch of things wrong, you're dead.
Yes.
And so like, again, this is like couching goals, right? Like people want to
Yeah.
like couch goals, and they're like, oh, well, I would go to nature, but like only if I'm glamping or something like that. And it's like, cool, glamping's fun, like that's great, but like you're still couching like what it means to like be out there and like survive. And so
Mhm.
I think there's something really interesting about just like being in the elements, and like it's there's a lot of binary outcomes. Like, it's not like, like you either get, like in the animal world or whatever, like animals either get eaten or they don't get eaten, like, or they
Yeah.
escape and they keep going. And there's not like a lot of this, like, hey, that animal got eaten, but, it tried really hard to get away. Like, we're going to give it points. Like, it doesn't like if you tried really hard
It's a
to,
participation trophy.
yeah, there's none of that. And so what's nice about that, like what's bad about it is that like it's an ideal and you get judged off of it, right? Like it's like, hey, if you do that and you survive, like, and you're like, oh, I didn't finish the hike or I didn't finish the race, then it's like, okay, well, that's like a DNF. But what's good about that is that like it actually helps calibrate you to do better things. And so I'm a person, I really like feedback, even if it's critical. Like I will ask people for like like, you're not gonna hurt my feelings. Be super critical. Let me know what to fix, and I'll fix it. I think when people are not as you like, if people take that more personally than they do, when people take it more personally, that makes things harder for them, because then they're like, that's reflective on me as a person. And for me, it's much more like, no, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. Let me fix this. It's like a way I behave, not who I am.
Yeah.
And so I think with, maybe this is getting too philosophical, but like when it comes to nature, people don't like the idea of having like this like binary outcome, because it seems super harsh, or it seems super like maybe offensive to their person. And it's really just like, well, maybe you just need to learn some survival skills. Maybe you need to learn, what to do out there next time. Maybe you need to learn to bring more water. And instead of using it as a learning opportunity, they feel judged a lot. So
Yeah.
I think maybe that's it. But, I think also like people just don't know sometimes. Sometimes they need introductory baby experiences that seem really challenging for them to find out. And they find out that's something they really like.
Sure.
And so there's just not a lot of exposure, especially if you're from like someplace like the Midwest. You just grew around up in the suburbs and around buildings all the time. Like you don't get a chance to see, what's out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've all got to start somewhere, because everyone is starting in a different place based on how they were raised or where they grew up from. One of the things that you touched on there, as far as feedback and how people react to that. There's a book called Mindset, and it's about the difference between a fixed versus a growth mindset. Really good book. And there's so many people, and I've been going through this myself, as far as just being stuck in this fixed mindset of this is how everything is. It's black and white. And, I can't change or take feedback, because if I'm getting feedback on something and it's critical or negative, then that's a reflection of me, as opposed to, like you were mentioning, using that as constructive criticism to learn and grow and improve. And that's not who I am. It's just an element of something that I'm doing or whatever, and trying to take that and improving on it, which would be a more growth mindset that can help for lifelong growth and improvement.
Yeah, I think it's, phrasing it like that. It's like, it's not anything about who you are. It's just like you did one thing and maybe that's not the correct thing. So like, if you're like, out in the wilderness and you drank from the wrong water source, like you're going to get sick and you're going to learn not to do that again.
Yeah.
Boil your water, like you're going to, there, sometimes there's correct things to do and there's incorrect things to do. And so, I find that's super helpful. Just removing the things that you did from like your identity. It's like a separate issue. And when you can do that, you can actually take lessons and learn them, versus like, oh my gosh, is the attack on who I am and everything that I stand for as a human being on this earth. Like that's that. I think I would have a hard time if I thought criticism meant that too. So,
Sure. I think that may be harder for us as men as well at times, just because we get so tied up into our accomplishments and things that we do, and it kind of defines us to an extent, or we let it define us.
Yeah, I mean, it can. It depends on what the goal is. Like, it's like, do you want to look really good, or do you want to, like, if we're caught up in like, making sure that we look in a certain way, or versus like acting the best way possible, or like be the most helpful, or whatever the goal is. Like, if you define the goal as like looking really cool, like, and you do something that makes you look stupid, yeah, like then it is gonna like affect your your outlook. But if you're like, hey, this is
Yep.
I do this with lifting a lot of times. Like, I'm an athlete. I've worked out a bunch, but like when it comes to like Olympic lifts, like I'm not the best Olympic lifter at all. And so like I'll always have like coaches come around and they'll like tweak me or tell me what to do. And I'm like, listen, I have some internet fitness businesses and I do all this other stuff. Like I should know these things, but it's just like, like you can't be good at everything. Like you can't be the best guy at
Sure.
all the things. So when it comes down to that stuff, I'm just like, you know what? I'm okay not being like the greatest Olympic lifter in the world. Like when I do it, I'm doing it more for form and, function, but like I'm probably gonna look dumb, and I'm okay looking dumb because
That's okay.
like I'm gonna get less dumb and I'm gonna get stronger over it, and that's the preferred outcome. I'd rather get stronger than look cool all the time.
Yeah, that definitely takes a little bit of letting go of the ego. But I think that's really the only time we learn is when we do,
Yeah.
which kind of sucks at times.
Well, it's been fun because another example. So I learned maybe a little less extreme. I learned to wake surf this summer.
Yeah.
Never done any board sports or water sports, and so I'm just getting I'm just wake surfing and wakeboarding. And so I just was biting it over and over and over this summer. And I'm like 30. I'm at my 30s, and so I'm like, okay, I'm supposed to know these things, or I'm supposed to I think of myself as an athlete, and I'm supposed to have these things figured out. And I'm just behind the boat, just crashing over and over and over again. But I'm like, you sit down, and if I get super defensive, and I'm like, no, I got this. Like, it doesn't help me get any better. But they would come back and they'd be like, well, it looks like you're too far forward on the board. That's why you flipped over, or you're not balancing the correct way. And I was like, oh, okay. And it's so much more helpful just to instead of fighting it, to just okay, receive the feedback. Nobody's, if there were jerks, I'd probably not be, a big fan of it, but they're all trying to help me get better. So,
yeah,
I think understanding the intent of the criticism as well is really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jewel, what's an adventurous experience that you never want to repeat?
Like outdoors, or can it be anything?
Yeah, either one. Just one that you've gone through, and maybe that was one of your impossible challenges, or one of the ultra marathons, or anything there.
I got stuck in Doha, Qatar, for 48 hours without a passport. And yeah.
Let's hear this story.
Would not recommend. No, it's just I was in the middle of the races, and I was flying from Hong Kong to South Africa, and it was a layover in Doha. And I got on my flight to go to South Africa. I'd been there before, and one of South Africa's rules is you have to have 2 back-to-back pages on your passport, so they could do big visas. If you're from if you've traveled internationally, sometimes visa will take up an entire page of your passport. And so they say, just to be safe, you should have 2 back-to-back. I've been to South Africa. They've got these little stamps, and they don't need 2 full pages. And in the past, they've never done that. But the airline is responsible for taking you back to your host country if you get kicked out of the original country. And so the airline was like, you don't have 2 pages back-to-back. I'm like, I've got a bunch of empty pages. I just don't have anything back-to-back. And they're like, no. And so they basically, if you know anything about Doha, all their flights go out between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., all the connecting things. And so my flight was at 1 a.m. in the morning. They wouldn't let me on. They made me wait in the airport until 8 a.m. until I could call the U.S. consulate and be or the embassy, and say hey, can I come in and get my passport? And it just ended up being this sleepless 48-hour thing of me running around Doha getting a new temporary, it looks like a fake passport. It's 3 pages long. But I had to find a printer, get new photos taken, all this different stuff. And you're just I never want to come back here again. I'm good. So that's, I never want to do that again. I did a ultra marathon in Thailand 2 weeks after I did this Antarctica race, and it was half the distance. And so in my mind, I'm I'm going to kill this thing. I just did 100K. This is a 50K. This is easy. This is going to be one of the shorter races. And it was not. It was jungle. So it was just hot and humid and sweating. And it was all up downs and out and backs. And so
oh wow,
it was just the most demoralizing course, because you're not really going anywhere. You're just you're it's a pedal shape. So you're going out and back and then out and back. and you're just like seeing the same people over and over. You're going up and down. You're not like making progress through anything. And I was just like, that it was not the farthest race, but I've never wanted to quit anything more than I wanted to quit that race. And again, it was just like, you're in Thailand. You're not going home until you finish this thing. So deal with it.
At least there was some good food afterwards, I'm sure.
Yeah. It was good.
There's that. Nice. Joel, so we're really big on conservation and improving our environment and soil and water and all of that stuff, as I know you are as well. Where do you see the biggest need is today when it comes to those things?
On conservation?
Yeah, conservation and just all around like natural health when it comes to our natural environment.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm the best person about this. Like, I'm not super involved in conservation, other than like I love like national parks and spending time out in nature. But I think the biggest thing is just like getting people exposure, like finding small or big ways to like introduce them into nature and figuring out like what's out there. I remember the first time I did a road trip out west, and getting to drive through like Yellowstone and Glacier National and like all this other stuff. Like once you see that stuff, you're like,
yeah,
it's not just like, oh, we're taking down rainforest, like stuff like that. It's much more visceral. You're like, oh my God, like don't mess with the glacier. It's amazing. Like it's awesome.
Yeah.
And so I think exposure to this stuff is just super important. And then also doing it in ways that people have good experiences. Talked about this with the limits of like, creating challenging experiences for people that are memorable. You don't want them to be super easy, but like also safe for them. So like they're not like, backcountry, hiking, the first time after, never being in it. So
sure.
I find, in some ways trail races are really good. It's a lot of times they're crude. You get to see, different parts of, a forest or, some sort of nature feature that you've never been to.
Mm-hmm.
But there's people around. There's like bailout points if things get too tough. But you get to experience that on a regular basis. I think those are really useful. And then there's also, with trail racing, cleanup and like preservation of the trails is a big thing. And so I think anytime someone has a chance to go do something in nature and share about it, I think is huge. I think getting people out into nature is massive, and just like it feels good to be surrounded by trees or to be at top of a mountain lake or something like that. You're like, yeah. I get to do this. This is free. Like just out here waiting for us. That's cool. And so, it's the best marketing is a good product, and I think nature is a pretty good product. So, just get more people's eyes on it.
That's a great point. Well, and that leads me into my next question as far as like marketing and products. What gear or products or equipment do you take with you when you are doing an adventure race or any of these other excursions that you have been a part of?
Yeah, so a lot of it's climate dependent on like where I'm at. So like what I wore in Antarctica is very different than what I wore in Thailand. But it was funny because for Antarctica, I just went to like a gear shop and I was like, listen, I'm going to Antarctica. Don't want to die. And we just did like this whole thing where they're like bringing a bunch of stuff out. So, I have like actual kits for cold weather racing. The one thing that really screwed me up, I had a Camelback. So two other things. So there's two types of races. Usually there's a loop race and there's end to end. So end to end, you're carrying everything with you, just like you would on a hike. Loop races, you can do stash bags or, you can do other things. And so, for Antarctica, the nice part was it was like a 10K loop 10 times. So I could bring stuff, but I didn't have to carry so much gear with me. With some of the other end-to-end races, the Finland one, for example, like I had a backpack. I had like a mini, it wasn't a rucksack, but it was like a slimmed down kind of little rucksack that I was actually running with a bladder in it. But the bladder exploded because of the temperature, like 5 minutes before race time. So I ended up having to like, grab some water bottles, and that's why I ran out of water and all this other stuff. And so I would say it's pretty climate dependent on what I end up bringing. But like usually, I've got a Camelback, and I try to keep relatively lightweight.
Sure.
And then, kind of like the go-tos are the shot blocks, like the gummies that I keep with me on a regular basis instead of like goos or anything like that. And then typically, as much water as I can carry, that's reasonable. And then, electrolytes and a few other things.
Got it. Yeah. What brands do you just love that you feel like just are doing an amazing job with the equipment and clothing and gear and, whether that's supplements or any of that?
Yeah. So I have a lot of Patagonia and I have a lot of, especially like my cold weather gear is like a lot of Patagonia. I have running shoes, typically On Clouds.
Okay.
If you're familiar with that,
not familiar with
running Swiss company. They're starting to get pretty big. I bumped into them the first time I did a race in Switzerland, actually, and then I was like, okay, Switzerland company doing footwear. But now they're becoming very popular. I do a lot of merino wool, like base layer stuff, especially in cold weather scenarios. Anything else? I use GoRuck bags quite a bit. If you're familiar with GoRuck, sometimes it's a little heavy duty for like races, but like the Finland race I did was a slim down GoRuck bag that ended up working really well, and it was a little bit more for a cold weather race. It was much more substantial and useful for me than other ones.
Probably had a little more insulation to keep stuff warm and protect it a little more.
Yeah, and just more space in general. Like typically, if I was running, like a couple weeks later, I was running the Thailand race, and you just don't like. You're gonna feel you're sweating through more. You're gonna feel the weight more in warmer climates like that versus cold weather. So,
sure.
Yeah, I think I need to lay out I'm like looking over there, like I can maybe go check out my gear list, but it really depends on where I'm at and what I'm doing specifically. But usually, like I think Patagonia is the broad majority of like my mid layers, and then I've got like a shell from Arc'teryx and something else. So
got it.
Yeah, a few different things.
Yeah, cool. Joel, is there a book or books that have had a big impact on your life over the years?
Million Miles in 1,000 Years is a really good read. Just really good way to kind of examine your life and story, and like helps you make decisions. Like if you're an author writing your life story, like and you're stuck on it, like what should you do next? Like what would be the good thing that an author would write, in that scenario? Like what would you want the character to do? And that's like a really good decision heuristic.
Cool.
That's probably my go-to book recommendation. There's a book. What is over here? It's Kiss or Kill by Mark Twight. Mark Twight is like this climber. He's if you're ever in Salt Lake, you should chase him down and like try to do a podcast with him. He's an awesome guy. He started a gym called Jim Jones, and basically like world-renowned climber, but then started a gym, and the idea was kind of like exposing mentality through physical fitness. And he's just got a bunch of essays on like physicality that like if you want to read them, you get pumped up and you're like, all right, now I'm gonna go fight a bear or something like that. They're real fun.
Cool. Is there a podcast that you listen to regularly?
I try to pick out like ones that like I like, like not everybody's already listening to or paying attention to.
Sure.
Honestly, a lot of the podcasts that I listen to are kind of like background entertainment. So I have like a couple NBA podcasts that will be on. I really like Lex Friedman lately and Michael Malice. If you're familiar with those guys.
I'm not.
Lex is on Joe Rogan's quite a bit. He's pretty solid. And Michael is just an entertaining. He's got a lot of different interesting viewpoints.
Cool. We'll check him out. Joel, what is one closing piece of advice you would leave for our audience?
If you haven't done something super challenging this year physically, line something up on your schedule by the end of the year. Just put something on the calendar. Go do it. It doesn't have to be crazy. When the pandemic was happening, like last year in the middle of it, I wasn't able to do races or anything, but I just got a couple friends and we did this all night race called The Longest Night on the longest day of the year. We just ran around a track as many times as we could. And, it's not in nature. It's not really that exciting. You're not really going anywhere, but you're just like, okay, I'm going to test myself and
something to do.
Yeah. See what you're made of again. And I think that's super useful, especially if you're talking about like rewilding people and like getting back out in nature, like getting back in touch with physicality, getting back in touch with pushing yourself and getting uncomfortable. Sign up for something that's going to make you uncomfortable by the end of the year. There's like 3.5 months left or whatever. And that's not a lot of time. And, sign up, go do it. And you might surprise yourself.
Solid advice. Joel, thanks so much for being here today. Really enjoyed our conversation. Where can our audience learn more about you online?
Yeah, the easiest spot is impossiblehq.com. That's kind of like the hub for everything. We have a bunch of sites off of that. We have a fitness site at Impossible Fitness, and we have a bunch of performance gear and supplements that are at impossible.co. But if you go to impossiblehq.com, you're going to find everything else. So that's probably the easiest place to get started with us.
Sounds good. We'll link all of those in the show notes at rewildgear.com/podcast. So Joel, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And we will talk to you soon. And for everyone else out there, stay wild.
Thanks for listening to the Rewild Gear Podcast. You could check out the show notes for today's episode at rewildgearpodcast.com. If you're ready to spend more time in the wild, our line of high-quality, minimalistic outdoor gear can help you do just that. Check us out at rewildgear.com.